All right. Top of the morning.
Top of the morning.
I am by ancestry a Scotch, named after a Scottish king, Bruce. I like that for some reason. Good for my ego. And English. But on one day of the year, I can be Irish, right? Yeah. So we can all be Irish today. And there are some fanciful tales about the land of the Emerald Isle, are there not? Yes. You got the shamrocks, four-leaf clovers. Have you ever, as a kid, looked for maybe an hour looking for that one four-leaf clover? I have. I remember doing that. And even now, I can't go through a clover field without at least kind of looking for that good luck of the Irish, right? And when I see a rainbow, I wonder sometimes, where is that pot of gold? Sometimes when I'm out surfing, I think, if I could only paddle to the end of that rainbow, there it would be. I had a really good sermon prepared for you guys today, but I had to do some original research into Irish culture. And after the sixth green Guinness lager, I was out of it. That was it. There's danger in doing indigenous research, you know. But the indigenous Celts extended from the Green Island, the Emerald Isle of Ireland, through Brittany, up into Germany, to Scandinavia, and through much of France. It was a huge pan-nationalistic cultural set of ideas about what was the divine. And that we loosely call Celtic spirituality. So that, for example, we read that scripture about God giving birth, that creation is giving birth, right? Even now, creation is alive. That's an example, really, in the Bible of that Celtic sensibility, that Celtic spirituality of seeing God alive in creation. And in the Bible, there's a word that you may not have heard. It's a very small word with a lot of big implications for understanding God and theology. And that word is debar. Have any of you heard of that word, debar? Right? Debar is what we translate as word. And it is used at least 1,000 times in the Bible. If you count the cognates and roots of the word, it's used over 4,000 times in the Bible. It's a big word with a lot of big, essential, foundational meanings. And the first one is in creation. When God creates the heavens and the earth, right? What happens? God speaks it into existence. But what that means is God's creative activity issues forth from the divine depths of God to bring forth something magnificent that is also a vessel of His own heart. The creative energy. So if you look in the Gospel of John, that famous opening prologue that we often will do at Christmas Eve. In the beginning was the Word. Right? And the Word was God, and the Word became God, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. That's sort of a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew concept of debar. It was in the Greek, it's logos. In the beginning was the logos. And the logos was with God. And the logos became flesh and dwelt among us. But if you would read it as a Hebrew, it would be, in the beginning was the debar. Or, in the beginning was the creative energy. And the creative energy was with God. And the creative energy was God. And the creative energy became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. And we are all one. We all have that creative energy, that light in us. That's the Debar. And we saw, I love that we saw that little clip about 4:1, you know, the witness to creation, that campaign in the UCC church. Because that's what this is partially about. Is that the Debar, the creative energy of God, is rift in creation, just saturates creation. And we too are a part of creation. We are not a part of creation. One of the splits that happened in Christianity is we started to see that we were split off from creation. We were separate from creation. We were often seen as separate from our own bodies. And our bodies were terrible. Our bodies were the source of sin and malfeasance and separation from God. And what we should strive to be was pure spirit. This is the Guinness in me here. This is a very deep, deep topic. And it's very difficult to communicate some of this in a short period of time. So bear with me a little bit. You have Pelagius, who was condemned at some point for preaching heresy. And Pelagius was a Celtic Christian, maybe a Celtic monk, who lived at the same time as St. Augustine, who most of you are very familiar with. And the two of them did not see eye to eye. They saw things very differently when it came to sin and salvation. St. Augustine, in the late 400s, said that we were all born sinners with a stain upon our soul that qualified us only for the wrath of God. And that if we died without baptism, we would die with that stain and wrath upon us. And we would go to eternal hellfire. That was St. Augustine's view. And that probably became the dominant view of a lot of Western Christianity. That if you weren't baptized, you could not remove that stain of original sin that came to us from the literal Adam and Eve first sinning. That's the fall redemptive story. That's the original sin story. That's not the only part of that story. There's a lot that's good in that story. I use that story all the time as a hospice chaplain, and I seek to weave into it the blessings of original blessing when I'm with people who are dying. On the other hand, you had Pelagius, his contemporary, living in Brittany, somewhere probably in Britain, maybe even in Ireland. We're not quite sure. And he said, no, if you die and you haven't been baptized, God doesn't send you to hell. You haven't done anything wrong if you're a baby and you die. You don't come into this world marked for wrath and death and destruction because of something that Adam and Eve did somewhere in a biblical story long ago. God doesn't act that way. What determines us is not our birth, but our life and how we live it. They say that Patrick drove out the snakes of Ireland. But we know now from history that there were no snakes in Ireland, not since the last great ice age, at least. So there were no snakes in Ireland. He did not drive any. But that's the legend, right? The legends grow up and stories grow up because they communicate the values and worldviews of the people who tell those stories. What is the worldview of the community that is telling the story of Patrick driving out the snakes in Ireland? It is this great clash of these two spiritualities, original blessing and original sin. And the interaction, Christianity was alive and well before Patrick got there, but it was a Celtic Christianity, one that reverenced creation, one that rejoiced and saw the beauty of God in the world about it, and that saw that the world was full of these hidden energies and forces that we could, with training and attentiveness and mindfulness, we could tap into and walk in harmony with. Imagine that. And for a couple of hundred years, that's how Christianity was a part of the Celtic people. And it wasn't necessarily seen in opposition to the ancient Celtic practices, but they tried to incorporate the best of those practices. Now, Rome had a penchant for organizing. It loved organization because it found in organization a power to conquer, a power to rule. And it used Christianity. It used that idea of a monolithic Christianity to rule the people in Britain, Ireland, and beyond. Wow. So this is a process that is going on from about maybe 250 AD, after Christ era, after Common Era, ABE, through about the 5th century, and then on to the 7th century. So 200 years after Patrick passed away from the Emerald Isles, there were still Celtic Christians, there were still Druids, still practicing. But by the 12th century, that had gone. It had pretty much died, except in the soil. And there's now been a resurgence of Celtic Christianity. What does that mean? The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote that there is a freshness deep down in things. Deep in us, there is a freshness and a grace that is our inheritance. It's who we are at the most fundamental level. At the most fundamental level, original blessing theology, the theology of the Debar, the creative energy of God, is that we are good to our core. We are good to our core. We are not bad to our core, as original sin might lead us to think. We are good to our core. We have been created. We have flowed out from the Debar, the goodness of God. Each one of us, an outflowing of this magnificence of the divine. Amazing. So, sometimes when I'm out surfing, all of a sudden it's like I start hearing in a different way. I start feeling more keenly, like my perceptions get elevated a little bit more. And I start to feel God more clearly. That's the power of creation, to communicate to us the wonder of God in our life. Yesterday I was out surfing and I saw a little bee that was dying on the water. A little tiny bee. And I tried to catch it, but it was too late for the bee. The bee died. And I thought of something that Julian of Norwich, the mystic Julian of Norwich, said. She said, I am that. I am the lowest. I am the highest. I am that. That's Celtic Christianity. I am that. And I thought, I am that bee. I am a part of that bee and its existence. And I thought, imagine if the bees were to leave this creation. And they are, aren't they? We know that. bees are in serious trouble right now. What would happen to the flowers? What would happen to the vegetables, the food supply, without the little, lowly, tiny bee? I am that, and you are that. We are all that because we are all interdependent and interconnected to one another and to all of creation. That's what it means when we talk about stewardship. As relatives, as brothers and sisters taking care of one another, we are that little bee. We are that. William Blake wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower." Have you ever done that? Have you ever stood entranced at a wildflower? Have you ever seen it? Have you ever held infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour? I bet you have. When you reflect back on your life in those moments, I bet you have. Because we all got it in us. And if you have it or you want more of it, go get it. It's out there. It's flowing. Here's something from Eckhart. All beings are words of God. Now translate that to all beings are the creative energy of God. God's music, God's art. Sacred books we are, for the infinite camps in our souls. Every act reveals God and expands God's being. I know that may be hard to comprehend. All creatures are doing their best to help God in God's birth of God's self. Whoa! All creatures are doing their best to help God in God's birth of God's self. That God is being birthed through you and I. Through the creative energy that we give birth to in our lives. Through the loving and the compassion and the bending down to help someone. In our kindness to one another. In our acceptance of one another as beautiful images of God. God is being born anew in us. Not just in a stall in Bethlehem in the birth of Jesus. This is from Yeats, who was a great Irish poet, and he wrote, "The world is full of magic things, patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper." The world is full of magic things, patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. The Druids were marked by snakes on their arm. They had tattoos of snakes written on their arms. They were the learned in Celtic lands before the advent of the written word. They were the ones who memorized the lore and the knowledge of the people. And they would train for years and years and years from the time they were little. And when they completed their training, they would get this snake. Now, there were no snakes in Ireland at the time. So what was that about? It was about unseen forces that people could no longer directly see or touch without instruction and help, without mindfulness training to put it into contemporary terms. This was what Patrick was trying to drive out of Ireland. Those were the snakes he was trying to drive out. He was trying to drive out the Druids. He was trying to drive out the concept of original blessing, because he had imbibed himself in the other vision of Christianity, original sin. So in us, as Congregationalists, we don't need ministers to see the hidden forces of God. We might need them to help us, to know where to look and how to look, and to be attentive enough to them. But we in ourselves, we don't need a hierarchy. We don't need priests. We don't need bishops. We need the land. I need the ocean. That's one of my big teachers. I need that ocean. It teaches me all the time. It reminds me over and over again of who I am and who I should be and what God is and the magnificence of it all. You have it in you. That's original blessing. God is in you, alive. His energy and His power and His love and His light and His holy dance is moving through you. Jesus said in the Gospel of John chapter 14, "And you know the way to where I am going." We do. And we just ask that creative debar, that creative energy of God, to be with us as an awakening and an enlivening presence, so that our days may be spent in joy and love and compassion and kindness, and so that when the day dawns, when we leave this world, we leave it certain and full of God's creative life, not only now, but in the world to come. I invite you to eat some corned beef and hash, sprinkled with some green lager, and this day, and remember that you are an original blessing. Whatever your theology, whether you buy what I was just selling or not, just remember, you are beautiful and you are graced, blessed. Thanks. Amen.